Welcome to EPG Pathshala. So we have a module on disaster planning for library and information centers. So in this module, we will be covering what exactly are the disasters, disaster management, and disaster planning in libraries, guidelines for making disaster plan, and of course, we'll summarize about disaster planning for libraries. By simply watching the evening news or reading a newspaper, we quickly find that disasters of various types happen to individuals, companies, and countries on virtually a daily basis throughout the world. And the libraries are no exception. A disaster is an unplanned interruption of normal business processes. It is a temporary state resulting in a short term change in the environment with damaging consequences. The word disaster connotes chance or risk, and risk is the probability of harmful consequences or expected losses resulting from interactions between natural or man-made hazards and vulnerable condition. In the library environment, it is any incidence which threatens human safety and or injuries or threatens to damage a library's buildings, collections, equipment and systems. While the word embodies a fantastic view of the unavoidable or inexplicable nature of disaster, it is also communicates a positive corollary: forewarned is forearmed. Disaster as any occurrence that causes damage, destruction, ecological disruption, loss of human life, human suffering, deterioration of health and health services on a scale sufficient to warrant an extraordinary response from outside the affected community or area as defined by World Health Organization. Disasters are relative and contextual. The damage caused by disasters is immeasurable and varies with the geographical location, climate, and the type of the Earth's surface or degree of vulnerability. This influences the mental, socio-economic, political, and cultural state of the affected area. A disaster may have the main features such as unpredictability, unfamiliarity, speed, urgency, uncertainty, threat, etc. Now let us discuss man-made disasters. Accidental sprinkle activation is part of man-made disasters. Then comes biological contamination, chemical spill, maybe in the oceans and seas and even in the rivers. Then civil disturbances and terrorism, which we come across on a daily basis. Then communication failure, you can experience maybe through mobile tower failure or something like that, telephone disruptions. Then construction failure, then ventilation system, then electrical power failure, electronic computer failure, then epidemics, plagues as part of health, explosions, then fire, negligence of our own people, maybe in the house, maybe in our libraries, maybe in offices, then gas leaks, then hacking, ethical or unethical hacking, then human error and carelessness while driving also it happens, maybe anywhere, any type, maybe in the libraries takes place. Then nuclear disasters, then robbery, then sewage overflow, then strikes, toxic fumes, vandalism, war, and water overflows. Then you can know this man-made, this minor mistakes from our personnel in the libraries. When water tank overflows, what happens to the libraries and the books in the libraries? So you can well imagine. So these type of man-made disasters can be avoided. So these causes can be rectified well in advance. Let us talk about disaster management. Disaster management is the combination of two major undertakings by an organization: the development of a disaster recovery plan and the implementation of those plans should the need arise. Disaster management also includes broader management issues such as finance, risk management, and training, and should be considered a key area of library management. Disaster Management Act 2005 defined disaster management as a continuous and integrated process of planning, organizing, coordinating, and implementing measures which are necessary or expedient for prevention of danger or threat of any disaster, mitigation or reduction of risk of any disaster or its severity or consequences, capacity building, preparedness to deal with any disaster, prompt response to any threatening disaster situation or disaster, assessing severity or magnitude of effects of any disaster, and evacuation, rescue and relief, and rehabilitation and reconstruction. Disaster management has moved to the forefront of library and archive concerns, due in part to the considerable increase of natural disasters in the past decade, but also because of the vast and varying collections of information in both physical and digital manifestations that are the most valuable assets that many of these organizations possess. The planning and implementation of disaster recovery plan must be understood by the entire organization. That is not a quick fix. It is not possible to extinguish the fires or contain the floods and quickly return to normal operations. In the event of a disaster, there is ripple effect that may require extraordinary efforts, resulting in suspended period before the status quo can be returned. A disaster management plan or disaster recovery plan is designed to prevent catastrophic damage from happening and ease up the process of recovering from any damage that is incurred, enabling people to overcome the confusion and turmoil created by disaster and providing pre-planned and rehearsed course of action. So disaster management is a broader term. So planning is one part of disaster management. Now let us discuss disaster planning in library and information centers. The objective of disaster planning in libraries, why we make disaster planning in libraries, is to protect libraries material to avoid a disaster by being proactive, to reduce possibility of a disaster and to reduce effects if a disaster happens, and to expedite response and recovery efforts in an organized and systematic manner. What are the benefits of making a disaster plan in libraries and information center? Fast response, avoid escalation, prompt SOP for pressurized situation, resilience for absence of key personnel, sound basis for decision making, avoids dithering, knee jerking, potential hurdles circumvented in advance to maintain the institution's ability to continue functioning during and after a major emergency, and to reduce damage to collections, to decrease the amount of time it takes to implement disaster recovery procedures. So these are the benefits of making disaster plan in the libraries. Now, having discussed about the benefits of making disaster planning in the library and information centers, let us now focus on what are the basic elements for preparing a disaster plan in libraries and information centers. There are five main steps in preparing a disaster plan. Number one, conducting a risk analysis, identification of existing preventive and preparedness procedures, making recommendations to implement additional preventive and preparedness procedures, allocating responsibilities, and lastly, devising procedures to respond to and to recover from disasters. So, these five elements are important while considering and preparing for a disaster plan. in libraries and information centers. Now, let us list out the benefits of a disaster plan. Disaster plan is fast, responsive, avoid escalation, prompt SOP and pressurized situation, resilience and absence of key personnel, sound basis for decision making, avoids dithering, knee jerking, potential hurdles circumvented in advance to maintain the institute's ability to continue functioning during and after a major emergency, to reduce damage to collections, to decrease the amount of time it takes to implement disaster recovery procedures. These are the benefits of making a disaster plan. Now let us discuss about the guidelines for preparing disaster planning. Now first of all, we need to assign the responsibility so that one of the key library personnel should start preparing the disaster plan for the library. And for that, we need to do preliminary research like what are the libraries which have implemented the disaster plans, and accordingly you study them and you can come to a conclusion what kind of plan is best suited for your particular library. Then we need to set up a license with local emergency agencies like fire, police, doctors, hospitals, etc. Then establish goals and tasks for team members. Okay, in a library we have say 5 members. So what kind of responsibilities as a team leader the librarian has to assign in case of disaster takes place. So that kind of thinking should be there. Then conduct a collection survey and determine salvage priorities. So you need to conduct what are the collection, what different kind of collection we have in the library and how to protect them. Like that, we need to make a survey throughout the library. Then locate and assess potential hazards. So what are the man-made disasters or natural disasters which may be problematic for the library building. Then consider financial implications. So, what would be the financial liability in case we implement the disaster management plan once it is approved? Then we have to think about implementing the plan. And what are the essentials to be considered for making the plan happen and making the plan into effective mode? And once it is the plan, we decide that the plan is to be to take place, then we need to test this plan whatever we prepared. Then if needed we have to revise the plan to suit our environment, and continue to maintain the plan and update the plan, disaster management plan for the library. Let us talk about developing a disaster plan. Where should disaster preparedness activities start? A successful disaster plan and staff training program not only teaches people what to do, but also how to remain calm. When people understand their roles and responsibility during an emergency, things fall into place much faster. Emergency preparedness is not simply having a disaster plan or manual, but rather it is combination of written documents, training, awareness, conducting drills, rewriting or clarifying based on those drills and ongoing training. This preparation process is conducted within the library, the larger institution, and within the community or region. All preventive activities should be incorporated into the day to day operations of an institution. Once the disaster plan has been formulated, it is important to decide how much time can be devoted to preparedness. A balance must be struck. Disaster planning may prevent other essential operations such as cataloging, filing, and user services from being carried out. Too much time ought not to be spent on disaster planning activities, only enough for the institution to be adequately prepared. A disaster plan is comprised of an introduction and statement of purpose, a statement outlining the scope of the plan, specific statements on the personnel with authority in regards to producing, implementing, and activating the plan, as well as coordinating with external entities. documentation of the distribution, review, and updating of the plan. It should also include sections devoted to actions taken during a disaster, emergency instructions, a contact list, preparations for disaster, instructions to be used if there is forewarning of disaster, and outlines of disaster response, recovery, and rehabilitation actions. All these issues should be part of a disaster plan. Disaster prevention. Disaster prevention is the first phase in disaster planning and the most important requirement in any planning exercise designed to counter the disaster threat. It involves identifying and maximizing the risks posed by the building, its equipment and fittings, and the natural hazards of the area. Although risks can never be completely removed, many disasters that happen can be avoided. The term disaster prevention refers to both measures to prevent an event happening and to protective measures to prevent or limit exposure of the collection. In disaster prevention, the following activities are important: survey preservation needs, identifying emergency funds and insurance coverage, train staff in proper handling, repair, and binding techniques, improve environmental conditions, protect computers and data through provision of uninterrupted power supply, back up the store of all the data, preparing a first response action list. Continuing with disaster prevention, there are other aspects which we should take care of, like compiling up-to-date telephone list of staff and volunteers, purchasing and distributing in-house supplies, identifying source of supplies, services, and experts, have comprehensive insurance of the library or archives. It contains cost of salvage operations and potential replacement, rebinding and restoration of damaged materials, and writing an adequately specific disaster plan constitute the part of disaster prevention activity. Now let us talk about disaster preparedness. The purpose of being prepared is to enable an effective response when a disaster occurs, and this is typically achieved through the combination of documented plans, emergency supplies, and staff training, supported by internal and external contact arrangements. Information and planning are the key to preparedness. Preparedness involves establishing the value of the collections and infrastructure of the library for insurance purposes and identify the most important material in priority order for salvage. Ensuring that resources to deal with minor disasters are readily at hand. This need not be expensive. Disasters cabinets or bins stocked with essential response materials should be centrally located and readily accessible. Disaster cabinets or bins should contain practical things that are needed to respond effectively, such as plastic sheeting, tape, scissors, mops, buckets, sponges, paper, towels, torches, and batteries. An emergency cabinet is very useful in case of disaster and should be kept fully stocked. Emergency cabinet contents are also desirable, so it should be kept the cabinets locked and break the glass tube lock for access in an emergency. Additional resources locally and regionally should be identified. Resources include expert advice and help, access to equipment and freezer services, transport and workplace facilities, and additional recovery material. Disaster response. The preparation process includes the actions taken for or just in case disaster strikes. It provides the framework for response. Response is the implementation of the parts of the plan that are needed to meet the institution needs in the context of a disaster. Common response to disaster is shock, confusion, and helplessness. However, it does not have to be like that. If staff is prepared, have taken appropriate preventive action, and have trained staff and resources, library will be able to manage the situation. Disasters can be major or minor, and this needs to be defined in the disaster plan so that appropriate response action is taken. When appropriate, library security staff should take steps to limit potential damage while waiting for emergency personnel to arrive. Such steps include making sure that users and staff are not in danger. The general steps for response include follow established emergency procedures such as one-page handout described for a major disaster. Senior management will activate the disaster response structure. When the site is safe and permission is given to re-enter, the extent of damage needs to be assessed. Protect material from further damage using plastic sheeting. Contain and mop up water and divert water to drains or other escape routes, example down the staircase. If necessary, correct environmental conditions to prevent mold growth using fans and dehumidifiers. Make a written and photographic record of events. This will be required for insurance purposes. Seek expert advice on the recovery process for affected materials and prioritize materials for salvage with regard to the importance, extent of damage, and nature of the materials. Lastly, list the resources needed, including manpower, recovery materials, expertise, facilities, transport arrangements, and a work area and equipment. Now, finally, let us discuss about disaster recovery and its follow-up. The recovery process will depend on the size and nature of a disaster, the degree of damage, and the priority and nature of affected materials. Maintaining services is also a consideration, and recovery is not complete until things are back to normal. The disaster response team and collection managers are responsible for planning recovery procedures. For most materials, this will include all aspects of drying, cleaning, sorting, discarding, rebinding, repairing, relabeling, and replacing. During the recovery process, after the occurrence of a disaster, the salvaging of damaged items and property as well as speedy establishment of services are the most important elements of disaster plan implementation. Recovery is what is done to get back to delivering materials and services. Follow through includes distribution of the plan and those parts of the process that are ongoing to assure that disaster preparedness remains a priority for the library. These include staff training activities and establishing collaborative relationships between the institution and emergency managers and first responders, example, fire, police, etc. Each disaster is different and something new can be learned each time. It is always worthwhile having a debriefing meeting with all those involved to discuss what worked well and what needs to be improved. It is also important that identified improvements be quickly incorporated in disaster planning. Let us conclude by saying that disaster planning is becoming an essential component of overall management plan for library or archives. The importance of an effective disaster plan is regularly demonstrated in institutions which are strongly committed to their plans. Preventive measures specific to computers should also be put in place. Indeed, prevention is better than cure, and information professionals who fail to plan plans to fail always. A well thought out and presented plan useless if it exists solely as a document on shelf. It is of course humanly impossible to be fully prepared at all times for any danger that could conceivably strike our libraries. We must realistically assess our vulnerabilities and familiarize ourselves with all the necessary steps to take in response to any emergency scenario we may be called upon to face in our libraries. So let us summarize this module, the outcome of what you have learned out of this module on disaster planning for library and information centers. So we can say that disaster planning is becoming an essential component of the overall management plan for a library or archive. The importance of an effective disaster plan is regularly demonstrated in libraries which are strongly committed to their plans. Preventive measures specific to computers should also be put in place. Indeed, prevention is better than cure, and information professionals who fail to plan plan to fail. So, hence, disaster planning in libraries and information centers should be given utmost priority while planning for collections and acquiring e-resources and systems and equipment, etc. That's all. Thank you very much.